So I'm going to have the first panel come on up to the front area here. As they're doing that, Chris Eberle is going to chair is probably an overstatement of what he has to do with the panel. But Chris is the professor of philosophy in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law here at the Naval Academy. His focus areas are in the area of politics and religion and the ethics of war. He's a prolific writer and has published widely. And he's also been very involved with the seminars that the Stockdale Center has had over a number of years. And Chris is just a mainstay in our Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Art, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic that I find that I love to talk about. I've been here for about 15 years and have taught the ethics class that I'm going to focus on and that our two midshipmen are going to focus on, and I suppose I've drunk the poison. I think it's a great course. I think we do a lot of things really well, and I think this is a terrific opportunity for us to share information about what we teach, how we teach it. I'm really interested to see how the folks at West Point and Air Force Academy and other places are doing ethics education. So I think this is going to be a terrific and wonderful opportunity. The first speaker we're going to have is familiar to most of us. Martin Cook is going to be talking about ethics education, particularly with respect to the morality of war at the Naval War College. We use a number of Martin's texts in our NE 203 class, in our ethics class here. And we use them because Martin does a terrific job of articulating the heart of a number of really important moral issues. He does a great job of identifying the central issues at stake with respect to the issues he addresses. So I think it's going to be terrific to start out with Martin on this topic. He teaches at the Naval War College, and I think you're the co-editor of the Journal of Military Ethics, which I think is very influential with a lot of us, and is on the editorial board for is it Proceedings? Parameters, yeah, and the Journal of Military Medical Ethics. And he has a book, The Moral Warrior, that I think many of us are familiar with, and it's a terrific read, well worth discussing and reflecting on. Okay, so we're going to start with Martin, and then just, if I can just say, we'll also I'll talk for briefly about our ethics class, and then we're going to have really the stars of the show this morning are going to be our two midshipmen. We have Eric Swanson, who is a firstie here. He's going to go into subs next year. And before he does that, he's going to go to Cambridge University to study physics. So Eric is one of the mids who makes me feel very small, like I don't really belong here. Could never have gotten into the Naval Academy, and the people I'm teaching are far smarter than I am. So it's a very humbling experience to teach here. And then Andrea Howard, also going into subs, also going into graduate education next year. And Andrea is going to do international relations at King's College. So, and they were both participants in the seminar this last year, and they were terrific to have in the class. It was nice to have somebody with their feet firmly planted on the ground to help us reflect on these issues. So we're going to chat. They're going to talk about NE 203, the ethics class that we teach here at the Naval Academy. So, Martin.
Okay, this is better, right? Okay, let's just do this. So Ed asked me to talk about how just war specifically is taught in professional military education. And so those of you who aren't familiar with the military system, PME is just one of our many TLAs, theater acronyms for professional military education. The obvious disclaimer to keep the lawyers happy, this is just me talking, this is not anybody's policy. I thought it would be helpful to explain the structure of the Navy PME system. First, unlike the other services, the Naval War College has what in the other services would be two different schools. What in the Army and the Air Force you would call the Command and Staff College, and then the War College. So we have a junior class and a senior class. And those courses were the same until about 10 years ago, and now they have been distinguished from each other, so they are somewhat different. So what I'm going to say is mostly about the junior class, just because of time constraints. There are three core teaching departments in the college. Strategy and policy, in which they read things like Clausewitz and Thucydides. National security affairs, which is about how things work with the budget and Washington and interagency processes and things of that sort. And then joint military operations, which talks about how to actually use a military force at the operational level of war. Students are organized into seminars with a set of instructors, one from each department, and they meet and discuss these matters throughout the curriculum. And then in addition to that, there are electives. The largest set of electives are the so-called leadership and ethics track, and it is the most popular set of courses, and that's where most of the people in the organization I'm part of teach. The faculty is a mix of various kinds of people. There are some pure civilian PhDs like me. There are some retired military personnel. Some of them have PhDs, some of them don't. Often if they do, they from our local Catholic school, Salve Regina, which provides this for GI Bill sort of stuff. And we have some active duty personnel, of course. The lessons in the core are taught by usually a single lesson author who is closest to being the subject matter expert on that subject, and that person then briefs the other members of other seminars how they should teach that lesson. So the expertise, as you might expect, it doesn't run all that deep. The way you try to address that is you have so-called bootstrap sessions where the lesson author goes over the lesson, gives some tips about how to teach it and so forth, but how it's actually executed varies widely among the seminars because faculty go in and do what they're going to do. So how is ethics taught in the core departments? Strategy and policy says they teach ethics, but the way they say they do it is by using basically historical case studies. So they talk about the Melian dialogue in Thucydides, or they talk about the American Revolution, or they talk about nuclear deterrence, or episodes in World War II. The degree to which the ethical component of those case studies is explicitly explored is going to vary widely by seminar, according to both the interests of the faculty members and the interests of the students who choose to take a discussion in that way, in that direction or not. The National Security Affairs Department has 3 ethics lessons, but none of them are on just war. They address questions of personal ethics, the effects of the command climate on the way people actually behave, and civil-military relations and professional ethics generally. The Joint Military Operations Department does have 3 what you might argue are just war lessons, but from the perspective of the law of armed conflict. That is, these are legal questions, not ethical questions in the philosophical sense. There's a lecture on the legal basis for the use of military force, usually given by Mike Schmidt, the head of our international law department. And there's a maritime operational lesson. In this case, they're using the example of the tanker war within the Persian Gulf. And there they're exploring legal concepts like innocent passage, freedom of navigation, transit passage, and other aspects of international maritime law. And then there's a practicum lesson where the students are given scenarios and asked to draft specific rules of engagement that they think would be appropriate for that scenario. So it's a chance to try to work out operational law questions as they would apply them themselves. Now, it's important to note that the vast majority of students who do the War College education do it by distance education. You know, I'm not going to read you all these numbers, but just look at them. You know, we have in resident a few hundred students. We have thousands of students doing essentially the same curriculum by various non-resident modalities. And I don't think, given the time available, I'll go through what each of those modalities is. Okay, I got ahead of myself. Okay. Sorry. Okay. There is no elective specifically devoted to just war. There is a military ethics course that treats a number of subjects, including at least a couple of lessons that touch on just war. I teach, along with Mike Pavkovic, a course in which we just read Thucydides from cover to cover. And those of you who know that book know that it's very rich with ethical lessons, but it's not an ethics book. It's a book about many, many things. One of my students once said in a review of that course, everything in the War College curriculum is in this book. You can just read this book. I think that's true. And then we have a number of courses in the elective track where ethical issues naturally arise. The one I have a privilege to teach every single term, along with Colonel Dr. Tom Gibbons, is the so-called Stockdale Course, the Foundations of Moral Obligation, which is the course that Admiral Stockdale himself created when he came out of his POW experience, because, as he writes in his writings, he believed the study of philosophy at Stanford is what got him through the POW experience. So when I went to the Naval War College, I actually didn't believe them when they told me that, no, students really want to read Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Mill. But it turns out they do, at least the ones who choose the elective course. My colleague Tim Demme teaches 2 excellent courses, Faith and Force, which is a sort of comparative religion course, both with a spin to how different religions think about legitimate use of military force, He also teaches with a retired Marine general, A Pen and Sword, which is a course in the literature of war, which also naturally raises various kinds of ethical questions. And then I've already mentioned the military ethics course and the Peloponnesian War course. We have 3, or maybe beginning next year, 4 annual ethics symposia. I'm responsible for planning and organizing those. If you'd like to see them, if you go to YouTube and put Naval War College Ethics in the search block, you will get the last 6 years of those lectures on many, many subjects. These are mandatory, all of them for the junior class, and 2 of them for the senior class. So again, a little plug here for the YouTube channel, but it's worth a look if you're interested at all. Lastly, we have something called the Stockton Center for International Law. I think it's a fair statement that no other DoD entity has an international law department as strong, or even any, compared to this. This is a world-class international law department. It's a freestanding department. It's outside the teaching of the core curriculum. It does support the core curriculum through those LOAC lessons I mentioned that come up in JMO. It certainly is the best international law faculty in the DoD. They are prolific publishers on all kinds of emergent issues, so if you want to see that, go to their website. They run conferences, they publish widely. But I will say, in fairness, it's not well connected to the rest of the college. It takes some effort on my part to even know what they're doing, because I'm interested in what they've got going. For example, they had a 3-day conference on the law of undersea robotics that I wouldn't have known about if I didn't have a neighbor who was from the International Law Department who told me, so I could go listen to that. So, it's excellent. They also sponsor an annual international law symposium in the summer, which brings people from all over the world, and which is truly first rate. So anybody who has any interest in international law, as applied to military matters, trying to come to that conference would be time well spent. Here's the website for the International Law Department. And I think I managed to do that quickly, so that's good.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about ethics education here at the Naval Academy. I'm just the setup for the 2 mids are going to come afterwards, so I'm going to be as brief as I can. We teach a number of electives here at the Naval Academy that relate directly to the morality of war, and there are resources. The profs are resources for people here. So, for example, Mike Skirker. Is Mike here? He was here yesterday, yeah. So he teaches a class on jihadist theology, which is quite interesting, very popular with the midshipmen. I teach a class on religion, politics, and war. David Guerin teaches a class on just the philosophy of war. And there are a number of other classes, the electives that we offer. But the primary focus of education, ethics education here at the Academy is a sophomore level, 3rd class course called Moral Reasoning for Naval Leaders. And it's a very distinctive class. I really don't know of anything else like it in the country. It's distinctive both with respect to its content and with respect to the manner in which it's delivered. So it's part of so just very briefly, it's part of a 4-year leadership continuum. So mids will take a class during their first year, during their freshman year, for sort of a self-assessment. And then the 2nd year, they'll take this class on moral reasoning for naval leadership. Then the 3rd year, they take a class on small unit leadership. And then the 4th year, they'll take a class on law and the military. So we'll talk about non-judicial punishment and things like that. There's a reason why the ethics class is offered during the sophomore year. The mids have to make a decision at the beginning of their junior year. I'm assuming most of you know about this. They have to decide whether they're going to continue with their education here at the Naval Academy. And so we want them to know what they're getting themselves into, what the responsibilities are of a military officer in the Navy and Marine Corps. And so one of the main purposes of moral reasoning for naval leaders is to make it clear to mids, help them think about what they're getting themselves into and some of the difficult moral decisions that they're going to have to make as military officers. Part of that involves war, but it's much broader than that. Obviously, the responsibilities of an officer are much broader than just going to war, fighting in war. So we spent a lot of time talking about a number of different issues about how you treat subordinates and disobedience to legal and illegal orders. I'll get to some of that in a little bit. So that purpose drives the content of the course. And I'm going to get to some highlights as to what we talk about in the class briefly. The class is really distinctively staffed. I don't know the origins of Al, you were probably here when this happened. You know more about this than I do, probably. But perhaps it was a function of necessity, but necessity eventually has become a virtue, I think. So what happens is, in NE 203, it's a teamed, it's a collaborative course. So what will happen in a given week is that a civilian like myself will get up in front of a rather large group of mids, say 60 to 80 people, and give a lecture on a philosophical topic or a philosophical text. So we'll do Aristotle or Kant or Mill or something like that. And then in the class, you're lecturing each class period, not just to midshipmen, but also to a series of military officers, typically 05 and 06, a couple of 04s. And their job is to take the mids into breakout sessions for the next 2 periods of the class, where they sort of take the theory we articulate in the big lecture and then apply it to particular circumstances in a variety of different ways. So it's an attempt to meld theory and practice in a way that's going to help mids understand what their responsibilities are as officers. It has good sides and it has bad sides. You know, there's an element of, you know, you don't have professional educators who are delivering those next 2 class periods. So there's a lot of time that we have to spend preparing, helping officers. So we do a whole run through of the class over the summer. So each new instructor has got to take 3 weeks of they're very busy people. They're people who have full-time jobs around the Naval Academy in most cases. But they have to take 3 weeks off over the summer to do a whole run-through of the class. And then each Monday, after we get done giving our lecture, we meet with the instructors to go over what's going to happen the rest of the week. So it's very time-intensive. But the benefits vastly outweigh, in my judgment, any of the difficulties that arise. And I just mentioned two very simple things and then go on to the content of the class. It's one thing for an egghead like myself to talk about discrimination, and another thing entirely for Marine Colonel to do it. And it's who has credibility. And the best advice I got when I first began teaching here was from my first military boss, Corky Vasquez. I don't know how many of y'all know Corky, but he said, you know, Eberle, you're an egghead. You do what eggheads do. I'm a military professional. I'm going to do what military professionals do. Don't try to be a military professional. Don't try to pretend you were in the military. You don't get any credit for teaching here at the Naval Academy in that respect. You do what you do well. I do what I do well. And some folks don't like that way of thinking about things, but I think it's really important for us to cooperate and collaborate, but clearly keep our roles clearly distinct. So that's the first part, I think, first really important benefit of the collaboration. The second thing is it's a constant source of new information. The whole point of the class is to help mids figure out what they're getting themselves into. And so you have people who are constantly cycling through the Navy and Marine Corps who come back to teach here. And they're an endless source of case studies and discussions of particular issues that they've actually gone through. And so they help us write up case studies, and we incorporate them regularly into the curriculum of the class. So if the point of this day is to collaborate with one another about how we do ethics education in our various contexts, one of the best things we found, oftentimes what we're looking for is a really good case study to raise a very particular issue that's live, that's real, that the mids can chew over with somebody who has experience on the topic, not me, the person, you know, the military instructor who is in charge of their section. I imagine you guys are going to talk a little bit about this, so I'm going to continue on to something else. But that's a really important thing, and if you all have case studies that you think are of benefit, this is, you know, pooling information would be a terrific result of a conference like this, I think. Okay, there's a lot of stuff we talk about. It's 16 weeks long. We do lots of different things in the class. At the end of each class, some of it's narrowly philosophical in some respects. At the end of each class, for my lecture, I remind them you need to think about, this is not a class at the University of Maryland. This is the Naval Academy. You need to think about these theoretical issues from the perspective of a military professional in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. And so we'll have a topic, like we'll read the Ring of Gyges by, you know, from the Republic. And so we'll raise the questions that you might ask about that with respect to you know, as a human being. Why do I care about being a morally upright person? Particularly if it doesn't benefit me. But then you always want to formulate that question in terms of what they might face as a military professional. So, you know, you want to ask questions about, well, are there things that are more important more important than morality? Military professionals are in the business of self-sacrifice. They're willing to sacrifice their lives for their subordinates or for the mission. And it could be the case that if someone is tempted to sacrifice justice or virtue in certain circumstances. Is that the right way to think about things, or is that the wrong way to think about things? So you talk about a question like a text like Lacan's Plato's Ring of Gyges story, and then try to frame it in terms that are relevant to them as future military officers. And I can go through that in a number of different cases. We talk about relativism, and then we ask, well, you know, can an officer in the United States Navy Marine Corps be a card-carrying relativist? Is that possible? Maybe it's possible, but is it desirable? Do we have a position on that? Is that something that the Naval Academy cares about? Y'all probably disagree on that issue yourselves. We talk a lot about religion and morality. A lot of MIDs are pious. They have deeply felt religious beliefs, and they have to think about the role that those religious beliefs play in their professional deportment. And so one of the case studies that we talk about is a very controversial case study about the captain of a ship who has to decide whether or not to give a subordinate emergency leave to go get an abortion. And he's deeply pro-life. And he has to figure out what he's going to do, given that he has discretion as to whether or not he gives her that option or not. And so he's used that as an opportunity to say, okay, well, forget your beliefs about being pro-life. That's irrelevant. Just pretend you are. What do you think it's appropriate for him to do under these circumstances? Right, so we have a number, that case study, which I think is a really terrific one, and we're happy to share with anybody, was given to us by somebody who taught the class. We taught the religion and morality section for years before we came up with that. And then it turns out there are a number of cases in which people have had to make decisions very much like that, although in different ways. And so you build up a body of knowledge that's very rich and interesting. Okay, I want to make sure we have room for our stars here. So let me just end by saying that there are a number of issues that we face. There are no, and I don't. So you're going to talk about a couple of the problems or concerns with the class. Let me just end by talking about one that I felt more and more recently, and that is, you know, we have this language here at the Naval Academy about holding people to high ethical and moral standards. We articulate a lot of those standards in our class and talk about them. And my concern with that language and the way we deliver it in NE 203 is that whenever you articulate high moral standards, people will inevitably fail those standards. We spend a lot of time, we talk a lot about holding people accountable to morality, justice, rights. We don't talk at all about what we do with moral failure. And I don't even know how to address that question. It's hard to know how to think about it in a very pluralistic society like ours. Those raise sort of very deep metaphysical, spiritual, religious questions. And given the diversity of our population and the people who deliver the class, it's really hard to know how to address those in a productive way. So my fear is, in terms of the way we deliver the class, very high standards, very little to say about what you do when you violate those standards. There's a great book out here that addresses these issues directly. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's by Karl Marlantes on what it's like to go to war, and he spends a lot of time talking about what he had, about bad decisions that he made, things that he regretted, and how people were unprepared to help him deal with the guilt that he felt from doing things that were really bad. He genuinely did bad stuff. What was he going to do with that? We have very little to say about that. I wish we had more, and if anybody has ideas about how to go about addressing those issues, that would be terrific. Okay, thank you. Now, would you like to?
All right, so as mentioned, I'm a physics guy by trade, and I have very little academic or command experience compared to the collective experience in this room. So that's why I'm here to tell you how to teach ethics correctly. Well, if not what I've done gives weight to my words, I hope who I am as the target audience for this course. I hope my perspective is useful here. I'm here to talk about my experience in NE 203 and how that affected my development, as well as a little bit about why I think it's really important to teach, specifically use ad bellum to junior officers. So I think maybe that could be used as an evaluation if my words are correct on those ones. So I would like to first say that, as Dr. Eberle said, I think the course NE 203 is taught very, very well. I learned a lot. I think it's one of the best courses I've taken in the professional capacity here. And I do really like the split between the military, like civilian lecture in the beginning and the military discussion afterwards. I think it kind of combines the two pillars of military ethics, both the practical case study side and the more academic philosophy side. So I think it's really important that we do it in that way. I do think it's very, very effective in how that's done. So I will, after saying that I do really like the course, I'll go and now critique it. So in NE 203, we only spend 1 week going over Jus ad bellum, 1 week over Jus in bello as well, and I think that should be given more weight in the course. A lot of the other topics, utilitarianism or the case study of Gyges or the religion and ethics and how they correlate are very important. But I think the Jus ad bellum and Jus in bello are more different than anything we've experienced before. I would say 99% of midshipmen have not even thought about just war or what it means to use lethal force against an enemy. I think it's very important that we discuss and really go into depth on that topic, more so than we do. For me, it was the most impactful part of the course, something I remember the most after the course. So along with this course, I think it's I do like the just war, like I said, is a very difficult topic for a lot of midshipmen to deal with because it's something new. I do like the placement of the course in the sophomore year before we make our commitment. I think it's very important that we all have come to terms or have thought about some of the ethical issues we'll be dealing with in the future before we sign our papers. I do see a drawback with putting it at that place in our education is at that point I had 1 year experience here. I was in a course with a small group with about 10 or 12 of my classmates who I really didn't know very well. It's difficult at that point to really have a strong opinion or really to have the confidence to assert that opinion. I mean, now as a big bad first year, I have no issue sharing what I think about things. But I do think it's very important in a small group discussion to have people who are confident in asserting something, having a dissenting opinion that it's difficult to have at the youngster level. But again, it's conflicting with the idea that it should be taught early on in our education here. I think one way, and Andrea will talk about this as well, of addressing this is to keep the NE 203 course there, but also return to the ethics part of the curriculum in a further course. One way there's space for it is in the junior officer practicum. So another issue is that, like I said, I'm with 10 to 12 of my classmates who I don't know that well. And a lot of the military professors have done very well with creating and fostering an atmosphere where you are comfortable having an opinion and sharing it. But there still are challenges with the fact that we are pretty young at that time. Another issue I do have is that since it is such a short time period, we have 1 week to talk about Jus ad bellum. It's almost presented as if here are the questions we have about the theory of war, the justice of war, and here are the answers we have to them. I think it's presented too much as if we kind of have it all figured out, and as we have seen in the panels yesterday, a lot of these things are not cut and dry. We don't have the answers. I think it's very important that even with a week or 2 weeks talking about just war, that it is presented very carefully as here are a bunch of really important questions we have, and here are some ways to think about how to answer them. Not so much as here's the answer to the questions you'll be dealing with. It's a small distinction, but I think it's very important in helping us formulate how to think about these issues. All right, so that's kind of my critique on the class. On the course, I think it's very well done. I learned a lot from it, and it can be improved in certain ways. The next thing I want to talk about is the importance of teaching Jus ad bellum to JOs. I think it's an easier case to talk about Jus in bello because we will be maybe not as some mariners, but we will be involved more directly in the in bello side of war, not the ad bellum, especially for the majority of our career. But I do think it's very important that we do teach ad bellum and really focus on it. I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir because the people here support teaching JOs this material. So I'll first talk about what is a possible pitfall of teaching ad bellum to junior officers. Should I, as a newly commissioned ensign or lieutenant JG, be questioning the ethics of the war I'm in? Is that helpful? Is it helpful to have a possible dissent or disagreement over what I'm being told to do? Is that will it kind of muddle the chain of command in some way? I think it's possible. I don't think that's a concern that we really should have. I obviously don't have the experience, but I don't think that really would cause many issues. I think the benefits of really having our junior officers understand the reasonings and the morals and ethics behind why you're going into certain conflicts is much more important. I think the main benefit is down the chain of command, not up the chain of command. Yes, having a junior officer who understands the theory of right intention and just cause and those ideas, it could possibly provide a feedback of the chain of command. But I think what's more important is that we can be someone who can explain the ethics or the reasons of the conflicts we're in to those below us. We'll be asked the questions. We'll be the one. I'll be sitting in the back in the engine room on a submarine with some junior enlisted, and they'll be asking me, well, why are we doing this? I need to be able to have an articulate answer to that and be able to explain what we're doing, to give legitimacy to what to why we're doing whatever we're doing, because I'm sure the junior enlisted might not enjoy being on watch for as long as he will be. Another thing that's very important is that as a junior officer, we are going to be ambassadors of the military to the civilian population. As was mentioned before, less than 1% of the Americans are in the military. I probably won't be talking in such high forms as the reading room, as the Admiral did, but I'll be talking to my friends back home. I'll be talking to, next year when I go to grad school, I'll be talking to other civilians who will have questions about, well, why is America doing this? I need to be able to articulate and explain what we're doing from a just war standpoint in order to improve the relations with the civilians, to understand what the military is actually doing. And I think that's a very important topic that I think junior officers are the place to, a demographic to start with that specific one. With that, I hope I convinced you that use ad bellum is an important topic, and Andrea will be talking about in bello and some more warfare area specialty specific ethics training.
Well, thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. I'm coming off of the Foreign Affairs Conference, so a lot of socializing this week. But it's always a pleasure to be a midshipman and to get out of class, but I guess it's all fun and games until you realize that the Admiral is going to be sitting there watching you talk. But I digress. So one of the most striking days, I think, in a midshipman's coursework in regards to ethics and leadership occurs when the teacher puts up a PowerPoint during your second class year, your junior year, and it specifically shows injuries sustained during combat, during infantry combat. At that point, I had already early selected submarines, and I remember sitting there and thinking, you know, unless something goes terribly wrong, I don't really anticipate being ashore in Afghanistan or Iraq with my submarine. So I want to emphasize, like Eric said, that we're so thankful for this coursework that we've undertaken, and it has probably been the most valuable coursework that we will take at the Naval Academy. But specifically what I want to focus on today is what does the in bello warrior ethos mean outside of the Marine Corps? Because I think there's a very heavy focus on Marine Corps tactics and the applicability of this ethics coursework to those infantry tactics. So in that regard, I have two major suggestions. And the first would be to include more community-specific in bello training to midshipmen and cadets. So again, Eric and I are going submarines, And those infantry-related lessons, while they are useful, and I think they add a lot of background, a lot of exposure to the thinking that's happening in joint operations, ultimately we'd like to see a little bit more training that's specific to what we'll be doing. And second, I think across the board, this coursework could focus more on John Paul Jones's punctilious courtesy in his qualifications of a naval officer. And by that I mean just in the day-to-day operations of junior officers, it'd be nice to have a little more case study practice in answering the hard questions from our enlisted personnel, like, what are we really doing here? Or more importantly, how should we be behaving in our operations? So I'm going to further explain both those points. So for the first, Eric touched on this a little bit, but I would recommend using our junior officer practicum course as a way to extend the ethics coursework that we have. So for us, that's from the course code NS43X, depending on what community you end up selecting. And really why I think this platform is suitable is because it's taught by junior officers who are coming usually off of their first tours in their respective communities. And it is mandatory for all of the seniors. You're taking the second semester of your first class year, so right before graduation. So instead of learning, for instance, just the difference between a pressurized and boiling water reactor, which, let me tell you, as an international relations major, it hits my heart. I think Eric and I have agreed that we would really like our instructor to push us in considering, for instance, that very pressing case study of what happens when you're asked to be the one to push the button, deploy the nuclear weapon. Or even what happens when you contact a maybe enemy submarine, you can't really identify who's operating, or an enemy vessel, and you're the one who kind of has to start analyzing the situation and present this case to your commanding officer. In other communities too, there's a lot of potential for this type of case study exploration. If you're an aviator, you're the one ultimately, like the Admiral said, has to make the decision if you're going to drop the bomb or not, or deploy the UAV in the future. For surface warfare, again, how do you address these threatening, maybe appearingly non-military contacts, especially in the Middle Eastern focus? The Strait of Hormuz is a very shifting, complex place to operate a ship. Again, how do you present that case to your commanding officer? For the second recommendation, again, moving away from kind of these commanding officer case studies and focusing more on the day-to-day operations of junior officers, what I call that John Paul Jones punctilious courtesy, I recommend talking about how to really engage in the discourse with your subordinates about describing your enemies and talking about how you should interact with the people you deem your enemies. That's something that we don't really encounter too much here, but I think it'd be a very valuable experience to be able to have people maybe act out these cases and say, you know, someone asks you in a day-to-day job, what are we doing here? How should we behave again? And so I think in both of those charges, whether it's one, making these cases more community-specific, or just two in general, focusing more on the day-to-day, we really should try to use the junior officers, because ultimately, as we walk across that stage in a couple weeks and get to be commissioned officers finally, they're the ones who are going to emulate. And I think they're the ones who are most in touch with the charge that we're going to have to take in leading our junior sailors or junior Marines in focusing and developing a good in bello perspective of how we're operating. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll be opening up for questions.
Okay, well, we have about 15 minutes for questions.
These working yet?
What's that? Are they working? I don't. Oh, hold on, that's working. Okay, we could share. How about yours? They're all working. They're all
I don't
okay,
think that-
great.
Does this work? Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
good.
good. So I'll just open it up for anybody who'd like to ask a question about anything related to ethics education.
I think I'd make one observation, that the gulf between what you're doing at the pre-commissioning level and by the time we see them back, even at the junior course, in general in the Navy culture, nothing has happened in terms of ethical education or training in between. That's something we've discovered a lot in looking at this, and so I don't know if you're familiar with the fact that we've got a new Navy leadership development continuum worked out. CNO has signed out on it. it's an issue of Navy culture we're attempting to address, that we need to address these issues more frequently over the course of a career. So, you know, it's not unusual to have people show up at the senior course who said, I never have talked about this since the academy.
Yeah, so therein lies the question. Anyway, I'll jump on the hand maybe is okay, so how do we advance the plan? I think that Andrea and Eric both brought up the same thing. How do you advance the plan, not only here at the Naval Academy, but how do we make up for that delta that happens between folks that are lucky to go to boat school here, or West Point, pick your service academy, and the soup probably will have some comments on this, just given where he was the last couple of days. But how do you advance the plan from there? How do you bring in folks that are OCS people that never had any background in it, and they're going to be commissioned in 8 weeks, and you don't have time to get any of this really deep thinking stuff about the profession they're joining? And then how do you fill in some of the in-between pieces between being a lucky ensign that got some of this because of arts grade programs and your grade programs, Chris, and now the next time they think about it is when they're a strike leader in a Tomcat squadron that's about to blow up a bridge with 1,000 people on it. And there's nothing in between, and I think that's something that we've all got to think about. And how do we take this on as a Department of Defense that is huge and get to where we need to go on teaching the right things?
So the best advice I got was not to pretend like I'm a military officer. So what to do after the Naval Academy, I'm not really sure. But I do think maybe we could fully fund the Stockdale Center to have a mission to go out to the whole Navy and do.
Well, you might know that Admiral Carter actually signed on the conversion of a school that we have up at Newport to be the Navy Leadership and Ethics Center, which is intended to be precisely that for the fleet. So far, one of the challenges are funding and manning, because it's still running the schoolhouse it was running before with basically the same people. So it's not really yet plussed up to be able to do it. But one thought I've had about it, you know, previously I worked for the Army, and one difference in culture I see is that in the Army there's a pretty healthy culture of officer professional development in units. So that, you know, it's a job of the commander to once a month or so have his or her officers read something, discuss it. When I mention this to people in the Navy, would a captain of a ship say, I want my wardroom to discuss an article over dinner this evening, they usually look at me like I'm crazy. That would not be something that the Navy would think about doing. And that seems to be a change that's just a cultural change. That could happen.
So Nikki Coleman from the Australian Red Cross Academy. So I have a question for the two midshipmen. So can you hear me up back? Okay, great. So we teach mainly a case study based approach, so I'm very excited to hear what you're saying. And we teach a lot of big case studies around things that have happened in war, so we use specifically military case studies. I every now and then throw a case study in that relates to their life actually in the academy. So we teach Army, Navy and Air Force combined. So do you dog your mate in because they've come back late from being away on leave and things like that? Is that okay? I'm asking, is that okay or is that too confrontational? What are your thoughts on that? Because they kind of look at the floor and don't talk at that point, and I just wondered if that was pushing it too close.
Well, I would say with the ethical issues, you can't push it too close.
Oh, okay.
I definitely agree that that's probably one of the most impactful ways of doing it, because just when you talk about these case studies that are off maybe 5, 10, 15 years in the future, it is kind of hard to sometimes put it in the perspective of what happens tomorrow night or next weekend. I think I would support doing case studies in that way, because it would directly force, I can say, yes, I would, of course, do X, Y, and Z in a certain case if I'm a commander of a ship in 2025. But I do think it is much more difficult, and the fact that the students are looking at the floor, it means that they have to confront it and think about it, and they're putting the challenge. I'd rather have a challenge in a classroom setting than have to deal with that looking at my feet when I'm actually confronted with a real issue.
Yeah, I can tack on to that just very briefly. I think those types of case studies are very valuable because they make students become comfortable with the uncomfortable. And that's something that you really do have to practice, and it's just not going to come to you all of a sudden when you take command. I think the best example that we've had at the Academy, a good example of that, not directly focused at midshipmen, but during our senior year, we also do what's called a character capstone. And for my particular capstone, our very last case study of the day, and this was after an 8-hour affair or so, involved an aviation mishap, and so we go about discussing sort of what should this aviator have done in response, and it had to deal with eliminating some of the evidence of the mishap that had happened and trying to cover the trail because it occurred on foreign soil. So we're discussing it, and then we all get this big shock. The aviator was actually sitting at the back of the room listening to us discuss these things, and the point of that was just to show us that it's so easy to talk about these things from a removed perspective, but when you start addressing issues that hit really close to home that you've personally experienced, it's very difficult to determine what you would actually do in that situation. So yeah, I think that's a great tactic.
So maybe a piece of assessment might be create a case study and bring it to class.
Just from the perspective of an instructor of the class, I mean, it's a really important goal of ours in the class to draw the connections between life here at the Naval Academy and life after the Naval Academy. And that's one of the most important reasons why you want to have military officers help to deliver this class, right? So, for example, we have hands, so we have 10 minutes left. David?
Yeah, this is also for Andrea and Eric. How do you think the theory works? I mean, I think that the case studies, it's pretty clear what the virtue of that is. You know, my own sense is that not everybody has a taste for Kant and Mill, and I'm just wondering whether you think that the theory integrates well and whether it's useful, and more the ways that you think it's useful.
I personally, well, maybe I'm the outlier, but I really did enjoy the theory side of it. And I think it is very helpful in giving us a vocabulary with which to articulate a response to a case study that we wouldn't have any other way. For example, the idea of utilitarianism isn't something that is really difficult to understand. It's can I get the best end result for the most people? But being able to answer a difficult question by framing it with regards to these theories that we're taught, it helps us logically go through the issues, and I think definitely helped me better arrive at an answer that I was comfortable with. That wasn't just, well, because I think so. It gave me a foundation, a background to kind of give myself confidence in responding to something. So I do think it's very, very important, even if we can forget the names,
You know, David,
yeah,
I've thought a lot about this too, because I've taught at the academy level and I've taught at the War College level, and teaching basically the same books, right? Plato, Aristotle, Plato. I think there's a lot to be said just for the sort of Western culture aspect of being acquainted with these texts. But it's often the case, you know, Aristotle makes this remark that the discussions of ethics are really wasted on young people, and he gives a couple of reasons for it. I mean, he says that they haven't had enough life experience to understand how this is really going to help them. And they haven't got their passions well enough under control to really want to be governing their lives according to reason. Now, I remember when I read that when I was 18, it offended me a lot, but now that I'm 64, I think it's true. You know, and I see the difference in teaching these same books to commanders and captains when they come back to us at the War College is a very different experience. I mean, now that this really speaks to them in some kind of deep way. Of course, they self-select, but you know, if you think what most of our military folks have been through in the last 15 years, they've got a lot to think about, and they need some tools to do it.
I was just say just real quick. So Eric definitely is an outlier, but another just quick point to that. I think the importance again of trying to bring back some of these questions, this coursework in the senior year would really be reflected the fact that we start taking things more seriously as that graduation date approaches. So with that, maybe in that junior officer practicum, if you're doing more case studies, that would be a perfect time to ask midshipmen, going back to the ethics coursework, of what is this an instance when you're making these decisions.
Well, a follow-on to that, and this is directed at the midshipmen, to this concept that you're too young to get this. You are expected to live by the honor code from the outset, so could you put the honor code in the context of what you're discussing in the classroom?
I think so. The honor code, it's based on morality, based on ethics. I think it's a little separated, even just in my mind, because the honor code, I picture it as it pertains to midshipman life. I need to act honorably. I will not lie, cheat, or steal. But in the ethics course, I think it's sometimes viewed as when I get into my my actual career is when this applies. Yes, they are related to the same topic, but I do think there is a separation in at least how it's presented to us, and at least how it's in practice. I think that's something that could be something that could bolster the honor system, is to kind of try to incorporate the more farther-looking ideas from the ethics course into the honor system. It could also bolster the ethics curriculum by kind of really connect back to the honor system. As of now, I think they're pretty separate in how they're presented to the midshipmen.
I think we have time for one last question. Jessica, yeah.
I have a question really to all of you about the relationship between how the laws of war are taught and how the war theory and military ethics is taught. So I'm wondering whether when it is education on the legal aspect of conduct of war, if that's integrated or should be integrated with discussions about the foundations of the laws of war, the ethical foundations of the laws of war. I'm wondering whether you think that would be a useful thing to do, or if it is done, to what extent it's done.
It's not done. I would say Admiral Kelly and Captain Meyer and I go to the Major Command course. There's everybody in the Navy taking an 06 command, and we spend 2 hours talking to them about ethics. And the usual response is, nobody's talking to me about this since the academy. And what I've always thought ethics was the annual so-called ethics brief that I get from the JAGs. It's about using your credit card and rental cars and stuff like that. And so the idea that there's any overarching frame to this is kind of news to them. And I think that's part of the cultural problem I mentioned earlier that we're trying to address.
At least the way I teach the laws of war is as a kind of a legal manifestation of the just war tradition. And so we spend most of our time talking about the just war tradition and less time talking about the law of war.
Does the legal education touch on the ethical foundation?
Yeah, you know, I doubt it. I doubt that they're referring back to any 203. You guys have just taken this class recently, right? I mean,
So yeah, I'm actually in the law class right now, and we just kind of, the last couple of weeks, started to move on to law on armed conflict. I can see the connections now, but I think it's because I've been a lot of experience this past year with them. I think it definitely should be tied back, and it's not.
Okay.
And I think one way to really deal with that is, again, going back to our catch-all solution of incorporating the ethics into the Gerard Practicum. The Gerard Practicum course and the NL 400 are taught usually in concurrence. So I think that would be a great time to try and reconnect those.
Yeah, I think the main issue that we have with this coursework here is that, and even in dealing with the honor concept, to go back to that earlier question, there's kind of a culture that has emerged that seems to emphasize not getting in trouble, not getting caught. And I think that's what most midshipmen are kind of taking away from this coursework, just at a very basic level, and not really taking the time to reflect on it. So hopefully if you were to incorporate, again, those lessons right before commissioning, that would emphasize to the students that they would need to incorporate this thinking into the daily decision making that they're undergoing as a junior officer.
You know, I want to pick up on that too, because I certainly, when I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, I had the sense that what we wanted to do was to convince cadets that they are junior members of a profession from day one, and to take on some of that, and over the course of the 4 years, to incorporate that as part of their identity. But on the bad day, they're just college kids in funny clothes wanting not to get caught, right? And so how you get past that barrier to convince them in their heart of hearts that this matters to their identity, not because of the institution is going to beat up on you if you violate it. That's the trick. I mean, how to make that happen. Every academy struggles with that.
okay.
We're going to wrap it up.
We have one more question, or that's not going to work?
We actually have to take a photo, and I'm convinced that there's a photographer.
Thank you to the panel members this morning. Thank you.